This is the solution to the Person UI challenge. We're going to be using GitHub to manage the project. So I'm going to be following the command line process that was provided earlier in the semester. I'm going to launch Xcode, create a new Xcode project, select an iOS single view application, and I'm going to call this Person UI. I'm going to choose to save it where I save my projects, which in my case is the iOS projects folder. I'm not going to choose to create a Git repository through Xcode. I'm going to be doing it at the command line. So if we go to that directory, which is Person UI, we have our Xcode project in that directory. So then the next thing we're going to need to do before we work with this project is to set up a repository on GitHub for the project. So I go to my GitHub account and I click New, and I'm going to create a repository named Person UI, and this is the Person UI challenge solution. I'm making this a public repository with a README and a gitignore that has Swift as its gitignore starting point. I'm going to create the repository, and then I'm going to modify the .gitignore to add .dsstore, and I place mine in the other section so that we're not managing .dsstore files. Go to the bottom and say added .dsstore, and then commit the changes. So I have my repository on GitHub. I have my project on my local computer. The next step is for me to set up the local GitHub repository, and at the present time, if I do an ls-al, I do not have a .git in this directory, which indicates to me this isn't in Git control. So while I'm in the directory for Person UI, I'm going to type git init, and then I'm going to say git add dot, and I'm going to do my first commit with the message that this is my first commit. So if I do an ls-al, or if I were to go visit the directory, I see I have a .git now, and that means this is under Git control. Now I'm going to add a remote so that I have an alias called origin that I can use to reference that remote. So I'm going to say git remote add origin, and then I need to supply it with the URL for the repository. So I click on the clone or download button and I copy the clone with HTTPS URL and I paste it there. And now origin is defined to be that URL. So with my origin defined, I need to take what is in my repository online and pull it down to the repository that I have on my local computer, and I'm going to do a rebase when I do that in order that the two histories get merged. So I'm going to say git pull --rebase origin, that is the URL that I created an alias for, and then we're going to do this with the master branch. So if I do an ls-al here, you will see that the .gitignore and the README have been pulled down from the repository. We'll also see here that Xcode popped up a message. It says, do you want to keep the Xcode version or revert to the version on disk? And this is because the workspace has been modified by us, and we're going to say that we're going to revert to the version on the disk so that it's using the current state of what it is we've created. So the next step is that we did not have a gitignore originally, and that means that Git on my local could be managing files that I don't want it to manage. So I'm going to make it forget that it is managing all of its files, and then I'm going to tell it to add all of the files to what's being managed with the gitignore present, which means it'll only bring into management the things that gitignore wants us to manage. So I'm going to say git rm -r -cached dot. So that's saying effectively remove everything. That doesn't actually remove the files. It just removes the management of them. And then I'm going to tell Git to add dot, so it manages all the files that are not being ignored by gitignore. And we're going to do a commit with a message that says that we applied .gitignore. And then finally, I want to push the current situation that I have here so that my Xcode project is available up on GitHub. So when I go to Person UI and we look at it right now, it's just a gitignore and a README. In this next step, when I do the push, we're going to have all of the files for our project up on GitHub. So git push-u origin, which is the alias for that URL for that repository, and then we're working with the master branch right now. So now if I go up to GitHub and click on Person UI, I have my Xcode project and all the directories and files. So we are about to begin the development of the user interface, and before we do that, I want to create a feature branch so that I'm not working in the master branch while I'm adding a feature to my application. So we're going to create a feature branch, and I'm going to call it feature / UI. And that created the branch, and now I am going to check out that branch. So I'm going to say git checkout feature / UI. And if we go to GitHub, or excuse me, go to Xcode and go to the second icon in this left panel, you'll see that this represents our repositories and our branches. And we do have listed here a feature branch called UI and a master branch. And it says that the feature UI branch is current, which means Xcode knows it's working on the feature UI branch. And I want you to also notice that because we named our branch feature / UI, Xcode created a little feature folder and put UI in it, even though that the whole branch name is feature / UI. So we are in the branch we want to be in to do our work. So I'm now going to proceed to build the user interface. So I'm going to my main storyboard, and this presents the view controller in which we are to place our design. The first object is a label that we're going to put the word name : inside of it. And I got to type label correctly. I'm going to drag the label out and place it in an approximate position to where I want it. I want it a certain distance down from the top, and I want it actually a certain distance over from the margin. So kind of somewhere in there. Doesn't have to be exact. And now I'm going to Control-click drag from the object vertically and choose top space to safe area. Now in the original challenge, it was top space to, or the distance up to the top layout guide, and Apple has changed the layout guide to a safe area. So if I were to select that and double click on it, I can choose the actual distance I want between the label and the top safe area. And what the requirement said is that this should be 10, so I'm going to change the 9 to 10. And I can also select the label and go to the ruler, and right here is the constraint that I just placed. We can hit edit, or we can double click on it. And let's just see how this is represented. So the label's top is going to be set equal to the safe area top. And the number 10 is the number that we put to indicate how far down the label is from the safe area. If I were to change that to 50, it would go down further. But we, according to the requirements, want it to be 10 down. So the next part of the constraint on this first label is that we want it 20 points over from the left side margin. So I'm going to control click drag over, and we see it says leading space to safe area. And if I choose that and I set some number over, it actually is going to be relative to the left edge of the view, not relative to a margin. And this is because in Xcode 9, Apple changed the way that you reference the margin. Before I set that, I'm going to click off it and just click here on the safe area. And didn't mean to do that. If I select the safe area, you can see the blue area represents the safe area. So if I control click to the left and do something relative to the safe area, it's going to be relative to the left edge of the display and not to a margin. So here's how we get to use the margin. I'm going to select the label, control click drag to the left, and instead of making a selection here, I'm going to hold down the option key on my keyboard, and you see that the values in this pop-up change. And so instead of leading space to safe area, when I hold the option key down, I can say leading space to container margin. So there it would be to the safe area. I'm going to select and delete it. And then, didn't mean to drag that, control trick drag over, and I hold the option key down and say leading space to container margin. You can see how that line only goes over a little bit, and there's this additional space between the label and its distance over, which is the margin. So it's control click drag, hold the option key down, and then select that you want it relative to the margin. If we select that blue line, I can double click on it to set the amount of space over, which is 20. I could also select the label, go to the ruler, and select leading space. It says label leading to super view leading margin, and there's a constant of 20. So that's like the delta over from them being equal. So instead of the label being against the margin, it's 20 over from the margin. And this value can be changed here, but we want it to be 20 over. So to change the value in the label, I could double click on it and put, as I should, name : in there. You can also select the label and go to the attributes inspector, and right here you can type in what you want in the label. So name is 10 points down from the top safe area and 20 points over from the margin. So the next item I'm going to place is a text area. And they call it here a text field in iOS. A text field is a singular line. A text view is like a box. So we're going to take the text field and drag it right here next to name. And on the left side of this, we want a certain distance over from name, which happens to be 10 points. So I'm going to select the text field and control click drag over to name. and I'm going to want to set the horizontal spacing, but also while I'm here, I am to center the text field vertically on the name. So in order to make two selections, I'm going to hold the Shift key down, select horizontal spacing, and center vertically, and add those constraints. So we can see the centering vertically, and there's a certain distance over. If I select that, it's currently set to 8, and I'm going to change it to 10. I could also select the field, go to the ruler and leading space, and I could edit it here and set it to 10. Now this takes care of where the text field should be vertically, and it tells us how far over it should be from name, but it doesn't tell us yet how wide it should be. So we're going to control click drag to the right, and according to the requirements, it is to be 0 points from the margin, and in order to get the margin options, I'm going to hold the Option key down and select trailing space to container margin. Now this blue line indicates that it is 168 points over from the margin, and according to our requirements it needs to be 0. Since I was already in this ruler section, if I selected that constraint, I could change the 168 to 0, and notice that it goes all the way over to the margin. Now the fact that this is orange tells me that there's a difference between the way it's currently being visually represented and the actual constraints. So I'm going to select the object and then come down here and click Update Frames, and now the orange goes away and we have everything in blue, and we can see that this goes over to the margin, centered vertically on name, 10 points over from name. Now in this text field, we wanted some text to indicate to the user what to do. And so if we select the text field and go to the Attributes Inspector, we will see that there is an entry here for placeholder text. It's a great way to tell the user what to do with this field. So we can say here, enter name here. And that appears in light gray within the text field. So this takes care of our first set of objects. These objects become, and especially the name : label, becomes the anchor for placing the other objects. So the next object I need to place is a label that's going to contain age : So I'm going to find a label, drag it under name, and drop it. And while I'm here, I'm going to put age : in it. And the desired requirement for constraints on age : is that it's 20 points below name. So I'm going to control click drag up to name, select vertical spacing, go to the ruler, hit edit on that constraint, and I'm going to say that I want this to be 20 points below name. So that is exactly what we wanted. Now we'd like the : in name and the : in age to line up with each other. So I'm going to select age, control click drag to name, and select that I want the trailing side. So this is leading and this is trailing, the trailing side to line up. And you see how it just popped right over there when I did that. So age knows vertically where to be, and it knows horizontally where to be, and its width and height are set by the content in it, because this object auto sizes based on its content unless you specifically set a size. So we have age. Next to age, we're going to put a slider, and then on the other end of the slider we're going to have a label. And the slider's width is going to be based on where the age label is, and this label that's going to contain the current value of the slider on the right side. So I'm going to actually place the right side label first and then put the slider between the two. So I'm going to drag the label out, drop it right somewhere there, and I'm intending to vertically align the age label and the one that contains 21 on the right, so I might as well place it there initially. I also am going to want this 0 from the margin, so you can see me bump up against the margin there. And I leave off. This is going to contain the number 21, and you'll notice that we want to align this vertically with age, so we're going to control click drag over to age and say center vertically, so we get that alignment. And then we need this to be a certain distance over from the right edge, so I'm going to control click drag to the right. Again, 0 points from the margin, so I'm going to hold the option key down and say trailing space to container margin. Now this box is in orange. There's a little dotted orange box in there to indicate that's where the label should actually appear. So the way it is actually appearing doesn't match yet the reality of the constraints. So with it selected, I can come down here and do update frames, and now the 21 is where we want it to be. And it is also auto-sizing based on its contents. So if we put a larger number in, say a 3-digit number, the text field is automatically going to become a little wider to accommodate that. So this knows where to be vertically. It's vertically aligned with age. It knows that it needs to be 0 points over from the margin, so it knows where to be horizontally, and that should be sufficient constraints. But I notice up here I have this leading constraint is missing, which may cause overlap with other views. Let's see if that continues to be there when we place the slider in between here, because right now this is only being set to be 0 points over from the margin and aligned vertically, and there was some concern with Interface Builder that if this thing doesn't have some sort of leading constraint, that as it changes size, it might overlap with something else. So we're not going to worry about that at the moment. So the next thing I'm going to find is my slider. I'm going to drag the slider in. I'm intending to vertically align it with age and the label containing 21. I'm going to drop it right there. And the distance between the slider and age, as well as the vertical alignment relative to age, can be done by control click dragging from the slider to age. And I'm going to make two choices here. One is the horizontal spacing, so I'm going to hold the shift key down and choose it, and then I can leave off the shift key because it knows I want to make multiple selections, and I'm going to choose center vertically so that it will be vertically aligned. I'm going to say add constraints, and so we have a certain distance over and it's vertically aligned. If I were to select that constraint, we can see that we're 10 points over. That was just me being lucky. If I needed to change the number, I could enter it there and hit enter. So that takes care of the left side. Now I'm going to control click drag to the 21 label and choose horizontal spacing, and this indicates the distance over to that label. And if I didn't mean to zoom out there, give me one sec. If I were to select the slider, I could go to the ruler, or I could double click on this blue line. But if I go to the ruler, I could say the trailing space, hit edit. Currently it's 131.5, and according to the requirements, we would like it 10 points from the label that contains 21. So did it right there. And if I select the slider, you see the orange dotted outline. That is as a result of, again, this is the way it's appearing, but this isn't the reality. The constraints are saying that it actually should fit in that orange dotted box. And so if I want the way it is displayed to reflect the reality, I select the object and come down here and say update frames. Now I still have this leading constraint is missing, which may cause overlap with other views. Let's see, leading constraint is missing, which may cause overlapping with other views. So I've got to figure out how to handle that warning. There's some level of concern here about my constraints. When I selected this, you notice it refreshes this panel, and this is apparently on age. So the concern here is that it doesn't really know how far, well, it does know how far over to be because these colons line up, but I guess if age were to change in size, there's concern that there's sort of no leading distance here. If I were to control click drag this way and say leading space to safe area, now I'm going to say option leading space to container margin, then I am explicitly setting how far over it needs to be. Yeah, I really never needed to do this before, and this could be an Xcode 9 thing, and I want to explore it some more. That definitely gets rid of the warning by setting how far over. I don't have any concern that this label is going to change size because age colon is going to remain its size. Setting this to line up and setting this size kind of, well, not kind of, determines the width of this as opposed to the content determining the width. If I remove this, then, and I can do it by selecting it and hitting delete, then of course this warning about the leading constraint is missing comes up. And I'm not sure that is actually a real concern given how I want to use this. So I'm going to actually leave that constraint off and then proceed with the rest of my design. So the next one is that I need a label that says gender below it. And I am going to control click drag up to age, hold the shift key. So we're going to have vertical spacing, and we are going to have the trailing edges lining up. And I'm going to say add constraints. And I can double click on the label, and what is to appear in here is gender colon. So notice the colons all nicely line up. And after the gender, we are to have a segmented control. So I'm going to search for segment in the library, drag the segmented control out. I'm going to place it so it's vertically aligned on gender and a little distance over. And the first segment is to have female in it, E lowercase. And the second segment, if I double click on it, is to have male in it. You can also select the segmented control, and it is possible to choose the segment and change the title over here in the right side. So I have my female male segmented control. It also said that this segmented control should have no selection because we don't want a pre-selection of male or female. So we're going to uncheck selected, and now female and male, neither of them is selected. So I need to set how far over it is from gender and that it is vertically aligned on gender. Control click drag from the segmented control to the gender label. Hold the shift key down, horizontal spacing, and then also choose center vertically and click add constraints. So it is the distance over I want as well as vertically aligned. You'll notice now we have kind of these two warnings, and I'm very much believing the second one is because gender is placed the same way that age is, that it is got an alignment based on the colons here on the right side of each of these labels, but it doesn't have any information about this left side. So the last object is that we were going to do a text view and place it below this other set of constraints, and we're going to have it placed so that it is 15 down from the segmented control, 0 points on either side from the margin, and 0 points from the bottom safe area, or as the original challenge stated, 0 points from the bottom layout guide. And so we're using the word safe area now as opposed to layout guide. So I'm going to select this text view and control click drag to the segmented control. I am going to do vertical spacing and add that constraint, and I'm going to set the vertical spacing to be 15 points. I'm also going to control click drag to the left, hold the option key down and say leading space to container margin. You see it goes over a little bit, and I'm going to select it and set it to 0. And then I'm going to control click drag to the right side, hold the option key down and say trailing space to container margin. I can select that constraint and set it to 0. And then finally control click drag down and say bottom space to safe area, and I can choose that constraint, and I could double click and do the pop-up, or I can go to the ruler and I can choose that this constraint be 0 and not the 380 it currently is. So we have the full layout according to the design. We do have these 2 labels giving us these warnings. Again, I'm going to want to further investigate this. This wasn't an issue before. I could line up just on one side, but the interface builder is concerned that these constraints are insufficient. Again, I could select, for example, age here and control click drag and say, holding the option key down, leading space to container margin, and I could select gender, control click drag, and do leading space to container margin, again holding the shift key to get that. And that would define each of these labels. We got one more thing here. It is worried about the segmented control as well. So it says trailing constraint is missing. And so we have here a constraint on the leading side that says how far over it should be. In the past, because the segmented control would have a size based on its content, then it knows exactly where this side should be. But it is possible that if the contents of this change, that the size of this changes. If I want to get rid of that warning, I could control click drag to the right and say I want, trailing space to container margin, and now all of my warnings are gone. So I clearly know how to clear those warnings. I'm not sure though at this point with the code changes or with the layout changes in Xcode 9 why there is the warning when there wasn't one before under the same circumstances. But because these labels are not going to change size, we're not manipulating them in code, and because the segmented control is not going to change size, putting constraints on both sides works okay. So if I want to test this now, I'll run it. I'm running it in an iPhone 8 Plus, one of the new iPhones that Apple has just released, and we're doing it under iOS 11. And so there is the UI. We are looking like it should look, and then if I rotate right, you'll notice it's slightly different than the picture that was in the original challenge. In the picture, in the horizontal mode in the challenge, there was space at the top for the status bar, the one that has what service provider you're connected to, if you're connected to Wi-Fi, and the battery indicator, that kind of stuff at the top. And it looks like now with iOS 11 and with the layouts we're doing here in Xcode 9, that in horizontal mode, the status bar goes away. If we were to rotate left, we see we get the status bar. If we rotate right, we see the status bar goes away. The thing that did happen here, because male and female had this trailing side constraint, a constraint on the right side, it stretched this control wider, because instead of relying on female and male to set the size, we determined the distance over from gender and the distance over from the margin, and this becomes the width to fit in between the two. I'm going to stop the simulator for a moment, remove that constraint that is on the trailing side, on the right side. I'm also going to take age and remove this constraint that I originally didn't intend to place, and this constraint, and I'm going to run this again. And we can see that the layout still continues to work. If I rotate right, then my gender, male, female, become their natural size. They don't stretch out because I don't have this right side. This is leading, this is trailing. The trailing side doesn't have a constraint set on it, so the width is determined by the contents female and male. Age and gender are lining up on name, so that's exactly what we wanted. Notice that this text field does stretch out because we set it to be 0 in from the margin on that side. The text view that we have here, this field, this is a text field, this is text view. This text view stretches out because it's 0 points from the margin on either side. So if we can move the slider. Also notice the slider becomes wider because the width of the slider is set to be a certain distance. Well, the leading side is a certain distance from age, and the trailing side is a certain distance from the 21, and that determines the width of the slider. If we were to pick another device, like let's say the iPhone X, and run this, iPhone X is not quite with us yet. It's supposed to be going on sale in October. This is a very different device in how the display is laid out, and so let's see how this interface works here. We do have a status bar at the top, but it kind of goes around either side of what's going to be the camera and the dot generator for facial recognition, but our other items are placed below it. We're a certain distance in from the sides. If I rotate right, you'll notice that the top status bar goes away, and this margin is kind of inset further. So basically they're looking at where the edge of the display curves, which lines up with where the bottom of the instrumentation package is. So that's really kind of acting like an edge, and then there's a bit of a margin, and then we're set up relative to that margin. Same thing here, because of the curve of the display, it looks like they're kind of setting an edge up here, and then the margin is bringing us in further from the edge than normally. And if I rotate back, it snaps back into position. So our app seems to, or at least our interface design seems to be working fine. The next step, because we've been working in the feature branch, and given that we've now completed the development of this feature, I need to commit this and push it so that we have the feature branch up on GitHub as well as locally, and it's up to date. And then we're ultimately going to merge this feature branch into the master branch so that we have the work that we've done in the master branch, which represents our working application. So the next steps are to say git add dot, and that says, all this new stuff we did, we want to bring it under git control. We're going to do a git commit -m with a message saying built UI. And then we're going to do a git push -u origin master, but not master. We're working on the feature branch. So it's git push -u origin. That's the alias to the repository URL. And we're wanting to push to feature, and then our feature branch is called UI. If I go up to GitHub and I refresh, you'll notice now that in the branches I have a master branch and a feature UI branch. I can switch to the feature UI branch, and here we have the work that we did right now in the feature UI branch. And the feature UI branch is the one that contains our design. If I go back to the master branch, even though I have an Xcode project, that version of it doesn't have the UI that we built. So the next step is to merge this into the master branch. We want to take the feature UI branch and merge it into master. So we're going to switch to the master branch. So I'm going to say git checkout master. Notice my Xcode automatically changed when I did that. It recognized that the underlying project I'm working with has changed. All of the work that we did seems to have disappeared. It hasn't. It is still available in the feature UI branch. If I were to go here to this icon, which is the source control navigator, you'll see that we are currently in the master branch. I could switch branches by selecting here, but I'm not going to, because for now we're going to still stick with doing our git management here at the command line. So I'm now in the master branch. I could even say git branch to see that I'm in the master branch. Now I want to merge my feature branch into the master branch. So I'm going to say git merge feature /UI. And so they've been merged. Notice, and here again, I'm in the master branch. Magically, the UI that I built appeared on the storyboard because we merged the work we did in feature UI into the master branch, and the master branch now contains the UI that we developed. So we have merged them, but the work that we've done that is now in the master branch locally is still not up on my GitHub repository. So I need to push my work up to the GitHub repository on the master branch. So I'm going to say git push -u origin, the alias for the URL of my repository in GitHub, and then master. I'm on master here. I want to push this up to master on GitHub. And so GitHub has now been updated, and we have our project available for being pulled from GitHub. Now I want to show one more thing before I leave this. I'm going to close Xcode, and I'm going to close that. I'm going to close that. I'm going to leave my GitHub webpage open. I'm going to go find my project, which is in Documents, iOS Projects. We just finished Person UI. I'm going to throw it away and empty the trash. So my project appears to now be gone. The one joy of having GitHub and using Git is that my project isn't really gone because I put my work up on GitHub. So I'm going to open up a shell, and I'm going to change to Documents and to my iOS projects. So I currently do not have Person UI here. And in order for me to pull this Person UI project down from GitHub, I would go to the clone or download and copy the clone with HTTPS URL. And if I wanted to retrieve that project, I could say git clone and that URL. And it went and grabbed it. And so we see right here, there is Person UI. If I do an ls-al here, we see that there is the Person UI directory. I can change to it. It has a .git in it. If I go to Person UI here, you'll see that the files are there. If I click on the Xcode project, it opens. If I go to the storyboard, there is my design. So I have access to the work I did, and I could continue to work on it. When you submit your work by having it on a GitHub repository, I'm doing exactly this to retrieve your work. I'm cloning your repository, and then I have a copy of it, as well as the history of the work that you did with Git.